In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. The Abracast. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Hello. Tonight on the show, we have Dr. Robert Price. He's a New Testament scholar, a scholar and an author. He's a fellow of the Jesus Seminar. He's the author of many books on biblical studies, the history of Jesus. He also has written a number of horror and sci-fi books. He's also the host of The Bible Geek and of The Lovecraft Geek. Bob, did I miss anything?
No, I should point out, though, I left the Jesus Seminar back in 2016 when they told everybody that their big agenda item would be to oppose Donald Trump. And I thought, hey, you're not speaking for me. And so I quit. But the rest of it's pretty much true.
The rest of it's good. Okay. You can find all of Dr. Price's stuff at robertmprice.mindvendor.com. And I just want to tell you that I'm honored to have you on. It's so cool of you to take your time to come in and talk to us here.
Oh, my pleasure. Really.
So I usually start by asking people if they were raised in a religious environment, like as a kid. And I was wondering if you could kind of briefly tell us about your journey to where you are now.
Well, I was born in Mississippi in 1954, and my parents attended Southern Baptist Church congregation, and I didn't go to services there. I just went to Sunday school. And it didn't make a huge impression on me. My parents were of sterling character, and they were just the greatest parents ever. But I know they believed in God, and if you died, you'd go to heaven and stuff like that. But they weren't always talking about the Lord, this and that. And I guess a lot of Southern Baptists, since it's so acculturated, don't seem to feel the obligation to be talking about it all the time. And so looking back, that was a big relief. But I believed in the basic stuff. And though I do remember once in elementary school, they had somebody tell all of us in the class that we needed to invite Jesus into our hearts. And I thought, what is this? It seemed to me kind of creepy, and I didn't go for it. But a few years later, when I was 10, we moved to New Jersey, and there, the closest Baptist church that they sent us to was a Conservative Baptist Association church, and they were more kind of zealous and formulaic and the jargon centered. Of course, I don't mean that was just a formality. They were all good and devout people. And that made me think, geez, maybe there is something to this stuff about having Christ as your personal savior and so forth. So I kind of got on the bandwagon there. And once I was in junior high and high school, I got very involved in the church youth groups. And through that, I was involved in witnessing and Bible study. And one afternoon in the youth group, and I did start actually going to church services and enjoyed them. But once we saw some film or film strip about apologetics, something I had never heard of. And it had to do with the standard stuff. Well, it's not only in the Bible that Jesus is mentioned. Here, and here they attest his life and existence, and you see, there's all this evidence that he rose from the dead and stuff. Like, hey, that's not bad. I had never really thought I needed the proof of it, but the more I got into witnessing and evangelism, I thought, this could be a great tool so that I'm not just asking people to believe in Christ as a leap of faith, but that there's actually reason to consider this. And that was the beginning of a years-long preoccupation with apologetics, and I found the contradiction that many do find eventually, that the more you consider all of these arguments for Christ and so forth, and especially if you're honest with yourself and you think, now, I do want to convert my friends to Christ, but I can't really use arguments that they ought to do it if I do not find the arguments convincing. If I were them, would I buy this? And so the attempt to buttress faith kind of makes it stop being faith. You have to begin looking at probabilistic arguments, and that's doubt. And that tormented me for some years. The more into apologetics and reading people like Josh McDowell and John Warwick Montgomery and so on, the more I learned, but the more I could no longer simply believe it. And eventually, I began to look at the other side, the scholars that they always said were wrong and that I needn't even really pay attention to. And I thought, gee, I've been had. I've only heard kind of a spin version of biblical scholarship. And so when I was in graduate school, I began to see what a lot of hokum the arguments were, and that, as I had always been told, if you thought your way out of evangelical Christianity, you would find life a meaningless void, so that'd be a bad thing to do. Yet, I guess around 1977, I guess I was reading a book called Fundamentalism by the great Old Testament scholar James Barr, where he refuted a lot of the most sophisticated evangelical Bible scholars and confirmed a lot of suspicions I had always had. And by the end of the book, I said, okay, that's it for me. I'm not an evangelical Christian anymore. And I redoubled my efforts to understand Rudolf Bultmann, Paul Tillich, and all these other viewpoints. And I guess I still, for some time, considered myself Christian, but the notion of miracles and the supernatural, I was not too big on anymore. I realized you couldn't prove this stuff, and it all sounded like legends in other religions, and that was probably true of these too. And so eventually I really went on the war path against apologists. I thought they were like charlatans, really. I'd take a slightly different approach to most of them now and figure that they've just been sheltered and don't know the whole picture. But some of them strike me as like oily political spin doctors. And I've debated many of them over the last 20 years or so. Most of them I've become friends with, and I no longer feel as aggressive and hostile as I once did. But I do feel, especially in my writings, obliged to use what I know, because I've been studying this stuff like for 40 years. I feel obliged to try to set the record straight. So I've written against The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, for instance, which is just filled with nonsense and is read by so many people. I thought, look, I know better. I've got to point out the problems with this. So that is the approach I take, but I do not have any urgency to convert people from their beliefs. I just want to get the facts straight, and it's up to them to do with it what they will. So that's kind of where I am now. I really have no interest in organized atheism. I find militant atheists a bunch of jerks. They're so obnoxious. Their policy seems to be, most Americans hate us, but not quite enough. Can we come up with some strategies to make them hate us even more? And it's so annoying. I say, you have fun. I'm not a part of this.
Yeah. So, on the show, it's well over 20 hours of talking about these early stories and the stories of Genesis in specific. So, I thought that I would ask you to come on because I know that you were interested in the book of Genesis as well. And, I thought you might be able to shed some light on some of these weird stories and stuff that we find in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that stuff.
All right. So, I mean, let's start at the beginning. I know that you're also a comic book guy, and in one of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen books, I believe it's the Black Dossier, Moore is writing as this character Oliver Haddo, who's basically his universe's stand-in for Aleister Crowley, and he's writing about the history of God, and he mentions that the word Elohim is both masculine and feminine, and it's also plural. I was wondering, that was wild to me. That's the first time I had ever heard that. And I was wondering if you have a viewpoint on that and what it might mean. Like, is it just talking about the wholeness or the completeness of God?
Well, that's what Jung would say, that the oneness of God is refracted through the conditions of the finite, the world we live in. And so the next step down from a pure vision of the divine, which is like in Hinduism that all is one, would be to say, okay, there is a divine being who embraces all polarities. So there's a kind of duality, and male and female would be one of them. But the higher notion would be that there's simply no difference, not only between those distinctions, but even between us and the divine. But it seems to me that in the Bible, especially Genesis, Elohim really is polytheistic, that they hadn't gotten to the point of thinking of a bipolar deity or anything. I mean, they didn't have Shankara or they didn't have Thomas Aquinas or Saint Anselm, and so they could, without embarrassment, depict God taking a stroll after the sun went down, so it's cooler, in the Garden of Eden, and having to ask where the man and the woman he created are. Hey, where is everybody? And because that's what it says in Genesis 3, I guess it is. And then he tells them not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, though they can eat of any other ones, including the tree of life, apparently immortality, and they better keep their mitts off of that, because it will prove fatal. In the day you eat of it, you will surely die. And then they meet the serpent, who tells them that's not true. You won't die when you eat it. And when the woman hears this, and she realizes that it was good for food, in other words, she had been of the impression that it was not, that that's what God must have meant when he said, the day you eat of it, you'll die. And the serpent says, in fact, if you eat it, your eyes will be open and you will become like Elohim, God or gods. I think it means the latter, because after Yahweh or Jehovah sees what has happened, he says to somebody, behold, they've eaten of the fruit and they've become like one of us. And so then he panics and kicks them out of Eden, so they can't eat of the tree of life, which they could have but didn't, because that would have virtually made the man and the woman gods. They would live forever and have the knowledge of good and evil, which, without going into a huge dissertation, at least includes center stage the knowledge of procreation. In this story of the creation, God never tells them to be fruitful and multiply. In fact, he doesn't want them to, because the whole reason he created the man was he needed a caretaker for this pleasure garden that he and the gods passed time in. And the trees were there to feed the gods. Just like in Greek mythology, the gods had to eat at least the smoke of the sacrifices and maybe even the flesh of them. And they drank nectar and all this to keep them alive and so forth. And they procreated, like Hermes and Apollo or sons of Zeus and so forth. Well, they didn't want the competition, however many gods there were. And probably they intended that there were about 70 because of later statement about every nation having its own god. But they don't want to be outnumbered by procreating divine beings. So God is jealous of his prerogatives and insecure about his position. So who is he talking to if there are not other gods? This isn't the editorial we or the royal we, as some have tried to say. No, one of us. And I mean, what is he, a multiple personality? That's ridiculous. And you also, now this is the so-called J creation story in Genesis 2 and 3. The famous 7-day creation story in Genesis 1 is from a different writer, the priestly writer. And in his version, it's not as mythological, and it's really a kind of an early science attempt to explain how the world was made. It's very much like Empedocles and Thales and all these guys who were thinking of the same stuff about the same time across the straits, I guess the Dardanelles or whatever, in Asia Minor. And so this writer has the creation divided into stages. The heavens and the earth, the water and the dry land, and eventually all the various life forms in their different categories. And finally, he says, let us make man in our own image. And it says, because of that, he created them, or whatever, Elohim created them, mankind, in his own image, male and female. Well, to me, that is telling you that the Elohim, the gods, included females. Otherwise, why would it make parallel the in the image of Elohim on the one hand and male and female in the other? So I think you have straight out polytheism there. And even in the Psalms, and especially in the Psalms, not only, you have statements about how no other God is like Yahweh. Who among the sons of God is like Yahweh? And there are other references, and you get in Deuteronomy 32, you have another kind of a creation thing where it says that in the beginning, when El Elyon, God Most High, implying there are lesser gods, when he created when he separated the nations, he basically, to paraphrase it, he distributed them among the sons of God so that each one would have a people to call his own. And it says Yahweh's share was Israel. And this implies that Yahweh was not even the head of the gods at one point. He was like Baal as opposed to his father El, which is just the same as El Elyon, and linguistically. And so then this implies, that was what Yahweh began as, one of the sons of El Elyon. But eventually, they streamlined all of this and changed Israelite belief significantly. Scholars call it the Deuteronomic reform. It's connected with the book of Deuteronomy and so forth. And they seem to have combined El Elyon, God Most High, with Yahweh, so that their nation's God became the God of all nations, and that he even plans to demote and defeat and punish the gods of the nations because they're not doing a good job of dispensing justice. And there's all kinds of to us weird sounding stuff because we just never heard of it and tried to explain it away. Now, one last thing about this. Most references with Elohim, even though it is a plural ending, the I am, have a singular verb, implying that, well, it must be the name of one character. But there are several instances, a good minority, but several of them, where it's a plural verb. And it's been suggested that originally, all over the text, it was plural. The gods did this and did that. But again, part of this Deuteronomic reform, when they had gotten to the point of monotheism, they said, okay, let's alter the text. Let's and the ancient rabbis freely admitted that some of the ancient scribes had altered it. They thought it couldn't have meant this. We don't know if this was one of the cases, but apparently leaving these loose ends where Elohim has a plural verb, to me, I mean, that makes the best sense as saying, yeah, the whole thing was polytheistic until it was revised editorially.
So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because you were just talking so much about this, how the other gods were of each of the nations. They were like, they ruled the other nations around. So when we were talking about on the show, when we were talking about Jacob wrestling an angel, this is the conclusion that I came to, like God was becoming the God of the whole world. And so he kind of promoted Jacob into becoming like like in charge of what would become the Israelites, and him wrestling the angel was kind of like putting him on par with these other gods of the other nations. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it implies that the guy he wrestles with, who wants to know his name, is supposed to be the god of the river Jabbok, which is where the thing happens. And that Jacob doesn't really, and this is where he's renamed, right? From now on, you're going to be called Yitzhak or Isaac, which probably originally meant may God fight for him on this person's behalf, whoever was named Isaac, anybody. And that they kind of read in a story saying, well, what if it means this is the guy that actually wrestled with God or a God? And so that's the way the story grows out of the name. There are many Old Testament stories where like Moses being drawn out of the Nile from that basket. Why they named him Moses? Why was that? Well, because they drew him, which was in Hebrew Mashah, out of the water, as if like it's a pun. Moses was part of several Egyptian pharaoh names, meaning begotten, like Tutmos means Thoth has begotten him, and all the pharaohs were supposed to be divine. Well, Moses was an Egyptian name, and eventually they said, wait a minute, how would the father of the Jewish religion have an Egyptian name? That's not that hard to explain, even given the story. He's raised by Egyptians, but nonetheless, there are a lot of those stories, and so somebody came up with a story where Israel, I said Isaac a minute ago, Israel was the name of a guy who had literally had a wrestling match with God. But the general, if you look at the whole story, it kind of implies, why does this why does his combatant pull this dirty move and dislocate Jacob's thigh? He says, I got to get out of here. It says explicitly he can't linger till the dawn comes up. He doesn't want to be seen. Why is that? Is he Dracula or something? No, it's because he doesn't want Jacob to know who he is, because he's Esau, Jacob's brother, who has been gunning for him ever since Jake cheated him out of his birthright, and but he doesn't want to kill him because, and then on the next day he sees Esau, and he says to him, brother, seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. Right? He recognizes who this was, and that Esau he was willing to forgive Jacob, but he had to get his licks in. And I'm not the only nut who thinks this. So it has different levels to it. But let's say one of the great Old Testament critics, Hermann Gunkel, thought that the storyteller figured that it was a god, and that Jacob therefore must have been some sort of mythic giant who had been demoted as the story got retold to something. So there's all kinds of levels, all kinds of theories. Nobody really knows, but I'm guessing. And I think the similarity between Jacob and Jabbok might imply that at some point the two were wrestling over who had the right to the same name. Because in the Semitic languages, Ethiopian, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, words are based on clusters of consonants. The written texts have no vowels. You just had to know how to pronounce it. And to get a different root word, they would just recombine the consonants. So it's very easy to imagine that Jabbok and Jacob were just variant versions of the same name. But who knows, really?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, so back to the beginning part of Genesis. We talked at length about the Leviathan story in Job, where Job starts to kind of ask God, what's up? And God's like, hey man, it wasn't you that, defeated Leviathan. And that story is missing out of Genesis. Like in Genesis 1:20, I guess it is, he creates the fish and stuff, and it seems like the Leviathan story should go like right there. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, this is the creation through combat myth that you find among the Canaanites, the Babylonians, and various other neighboring peoples. And the idea was that the gods were shaken in their sandals over the threat posed by these chaos dragons. And this is before the world had been created even. And in some versions, the dragons are actually the progenitors, the parents somehow of the gods. And the Zeus and the Titans and Typhons, yet another version. Well, the younger generation of gods is a little more gutsy. And so Marduk or Jehovah or, Baal or whichever country's version you want steps forward. And he's always the warrior god and the storm god, because they figured the thunder sounded like a battle among the gods in the heavens. Well, he says, I will take care of these dragons that so scare you, on one condition, that I become the new king of the gods. What about it? And I say, hey, look, go ahead, anything you want. And so he fights the dragons, Leviathan, Behemoth, Tiamat, Apsu, Vritra, many different names. And he gets devoured by the dragon and seems therefore to be defeated, but manages to overcome and kill the dragon from inside, ripping it open. and then, which is a kind of resurrection. And then he takes the carcass of the dragons and makes it into the heavens and the earth. And sure enough, they hail him as the new king of gods, and the humans are part of the creation. And so that's what it was originally. And there are references to this in the Psalms, where it talks about how God crushed the heads of Leviathan and became the king, took the throne, and created the world. And if you don't know about this background myth, you're reading through this and it seems incoherent. Why are they jumping from this puzzle to another? Well, it all makes perfect sense and flows together if you understand that by killing the Hydra-like dragon, the god proved his worth and became the king of gods, and then created the world from the remains. And so you do have that. And I think Psalm, oh boy, I haven't looked at this in a while. I think maybe it's Psalm 84 and there's Psalm 79, or maybe I have it reversed. Maybe it's 89 and 74. And there are references in Job and Isaiah about how the fleeing serpent Leviathan was defeated by God, or Rahab, another name for him. And so this is amply attested in the Bible, but it isn't really explained because everybody already knew it. But we can now understand it because of the more specific parallels that weren't censored in the writings of these other cultures. It's, now I get it. Now I see what they're talking about. But it sort of does make it into both Genesis creations, because the serpent Leviathan, and that Levi means serpent, and the than suffix is like an honorific, like the great or something. An alternate name was Nehushtan, same suffix, and Naas means serpent too, just a synonym. We're told in the Bible that before, I guess it was Josiah, kicked all the other gods' shrines out of the Jerusalem temple, the serpent Nehushtan had his own chapel and received sacrifices of incense, which means people prayed to him. And then he got rid of him. Nehushtan, what is going on here? Well, it appears that this story has been sort of dumbed down or Disneyfied, you might say, in the Eden story, because the serpent who brings wisdom is originally Nehushtan. And the reason he's a kind of sympathetic character, the reason he's telling the truth to the man and the woman, whereas Yahweh didn't, is that he's like a Prometheus character who is acting in the interests of the fledgling humans, which their creator, Zeus, didn't bother doing. Same thing here. And also in the priestly creation account, there are these little wink words that the Spirit of God hovered upon the face of the Tahom, the depth, the deep. That did come to mean that, but it's like a singular version of Tiamat, a plural, which was one of the names of the dragons in the Babylonian version. And then it says that when God created it, it was tohu and bohu, without form and void. Well, those again are the singulars for Tiamat and Behemoth, or Behemoth. And so what they did while they were making this more sophisticated, kind of like Thales and Anaximander, they had little vestiges of the old myths, but they had demythologized them. Now they're just the deep sea or chaos, but not a monster that God had to defeat. So if you know where to look and you look close, you can see, they shared basically the same mythic worldview as their neighbors.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much for that.
Learn more at abracast.com. Get bonus content by signing up for the mailing list. Get all that plus many exclusive episodes by supporting the show at patreon.com or subscribestar.com.
So one of the other things that we kind of debated or talked a lot about was what was the problem with Cain's offering?
That appears to be, well, like there's several Cain episodes that are very short and self-contained and are just patched together because the compilers of Genesis were just trying to preserve as many fragments of the ancient lore as they could, kind of like the brothers Grimm. They went all over the German countryside and asking nurses and old women and so on, tell me the stories you tell to kids. I don't want them to vanish. And they would. And of course, they compiled them. Well, the same thing must have happened here. And there was no inherent connection between all the Cain stories, but they're just strung together. Now, originally, there's the understanding was probably that Cain represented the Canaanites. He was an eponymous ancestor, and that they were big agriculturalists. And later in the Bible, we find out that the Canaanites had a fertility religion with Baal and Astarte and all that the prophets hated. Well, yeah, okay. This is why Cain, the father of the Canaanites, was making an offering of plants as he's a farmer. But God, now understood as the Hebrew God, who hated Baal, and they persecuted his worshipers and so on, he rejects that, but accepts the offering of Abel, who was a shepherd and offered meat in sacrifice. And so originally this was like, well, you want to know what to offer? Well, God, just like Price here, is an anti-vegetarian. Now, you'll never catch me eating those green things. That's away from me. Well, God had the same good taste. And of course, it's like he's saying God likes the Israelite shepherds, right? They're supposed to be shepherd nomads and all that, like Passover in the desert, etc. But he doesn't like those damn Canaanites with their veggie, vegan sacrifices. But then the next ones, like the thing where Cain kills Abel, never explains why. And we infer, well, I guess Cain must have been jealous of Abel. Well, that would make sense, but that's probably not the case. It didn't really matter why. This is one of many ancient stories like Romulus and Remus, where one brother kills another one. And then as it goes on, Cain he's trying to hide, but God says, I know what you did. Where's your brother? I haven't seen him lately. Well, that's because he's dead. And so he expects to get killed, but God doesn't kill him. He exiles him. And he says, hey, yeah, that's good, but wherever I go, somebody's going to recognize me and kill me. And he says, no, they won't. I'll put this mark on you that people will recognize and know to steer clear. Well, this is already impossible. Not that it's miraculous or anything, but it's impossible because if you took all the Cain stories together, who could Cain be afraid of? Who's going to kill him? His mother, Eve, his father, Adam? I mean, there's nobody else on earth as far as we know. And who's going to be after him and so forth? Well, by this time, in this story, it's assumed Cain lived in a later period, and that the Kenites, very similar in Hebrew, now Cain is supposed to be their ancestor. And the story presupposes that all the Kenites, who were fierce warriors, had a tribal tattoo, so that when people saw them, they'd say, oh, wait a minute, we better watch our step. These guys are Kenites. And so he'd step softly. And this is trying to explain where the Kenites came from. Well, Cain builds the city, names it for his son Enoch. Who was his wife? At the Scopes trial, I think. What did God pull off another creation in the next county? Well, no, this probably reflects this old royal ideology of the Middle East, where it was believed that Cain was basically an Adam figure in this version of it, the first man, and that he mated with the creator goddess who made him. So his wife was his mother, and so forth. And so there are other people by this time, and he has the son, and makes a city for them, right? What, do you make a ghost town? No people? Well, no, it assumes there were plenty more people, and it on and on it goes, and he kills his brother Abel in this one, like Romulus kills Remus at the foundation of the city of Rome. This another version, just the names changed, and finally the confusion of all of this arises because they have just strung together various Cain legends that were inconsistent with one another. Like in comic books, which version of the origin of Superman are you going to accept? They used to say that all the Kryptonians had superpowers, and then later they said, oh, no, that's just because Superman found that the yellow sun and the lesser gravity enabled him to do what he does. And they keep retconning things. How long was Captain America frozen in the ice? Originally, it's about 20 years, 50 years later, it was 70 years, and so on and so on. Well, it's the same thing. And the result is something very much like the old show Xena Warrior Princess. When did Xena live? Very confusing, because in one episode, she meets King David. Now, that would be about 1000 BCE. In another one, she meets Galen the physician, 2nd century CE or AD. In another one, she's fighting in the Trojan War. In another one, she meets Mary and Joseph on the way to Bethlehem. And so on. They just didn't care. They figured if it's in the ancient world, good enough. And I think Prince Valiant was sort of the same way. He's with King Arthur, but he's fighting Muslims, and what the heck. But they just didn't care because they're not trying to teach history. And I think that's what happened with Cain. There was no attempt to work out a chronology. They just wanted to preserve the bits of lore they had about this character.
Yeah, so the thing that I want to add is that it's interesting that Cain turned into like the farmer or the gardener, and later after the flood, Noah turns into a farmer, and ultimately God created this garden. So that always kind of was like a zigzag to me. Do you know what I mean?
That's right. Yeah, in fact, we're told that what is it? Jubal was a shepherd and a nomad, and that he was the first musician, the father of all those who play the pipe, etc. And that Jabal, or Jabal, as some say, his brother, was the first tiller of the soil. Well, wait a minute. Wasn't Noah supposed to be the first tiller of the soil, and before him Cain? Well, these legends didn't presuppose one another. There's even a Noah note early on in Genesis where it says they named him because they named him Noah because they said, out of the ground this one will bring us relief. And then couple of chapters later, we read that Noah was the first vintner. He was the first to discover or create wine. Well, so they're saying after a hard day of work, it's Miller time. And that's what they named Noah for. You're naming him for that and not saving what was left of the human race after a world-destroying flood? It's been argued that Noah in Hebrew is practically the same as Enoch. And Enoch is another version of a flood hero from Babylon and Sumer and so forth, called Zethus or and Gilgamesh, what's he called? Utnapishtim and so forth. And in these stories, the guy that is told by the gods to build the ark, because they all have those stories, he survives the flood and is granted immortality. Well, what happens with Enoch? He is taken up to heaven and becomes immortal, and his name is suspiciously similar to Noah. Well, that implies that the story originally must have had Enoch as the one who built the ark, and Noah was simply the little old winemaker. But somehow they confused the names. But they're like whoever thought Jabal and Jubal were these culture heroes who invented nomadism, music, and farming certainly knew of no world-destroying flood story. It's just that, again, the compilers have stitched together all these great old bits of myth. And I like to point this out. The writers of the Bible weren't a bunch of idiots who couldn't keep their story straight. They're not, often, many of them are not even trying to tell a coherent story. It's just a kind of a scrapbook. And we'd be worse off as historians without it. Not that it tells us what actually happened, but in terms of understanding these ancient cultures, the sad part is, the tragic part is that fundamentalists think they're the great champions of the Bible, whereas they have a theological straitjacket, a pair of blinders that forbid them to really understand it. That's that irony I just can never get over.
All right. Well, we kind of talked about the flood a little bit, and we talked about Noah. So what do you make of, I have a pet theory that I'm going to talk about later on in the episode, but what do you make of Cain and getting the curse for whatever Ham did? And also, what do you think what's your take on what Ham's sin was, or what Ham did wrong with Noah?
Well, for one thing, I am sure that this is a Hebrew retelling of the story of how the 5 sons of the Titan Uranos ganged up on him to usurp his throne. And the way they did it was to castrate him, because it was like the father of their country, and he had to have regenerative powers. And so they didn't need to kill him, they just castrated him. And the sons were, probably can't remember all of them, but Cronus, Coius, Iapetus. Oh boy, I can't on all cylinders, but that's what they do. They gang up, conspire, and castrate him, and Cronus takes his place. He's a great Titan also. Well, it appears that this story of Noah, etc., was a Hebrew version of that, and that originally it was not simply the one son who happened to stumble onto the site of his father dead, drunk, and naked. For one thing, that's a little hard to imagine in these ancient cultures. It cannot have been some great shame for a son to see his father or his mother naked. I mean, how much room did you have in your hovel? It's just impossible. So something else was at stake there. But in that story, the one who sees it, I guess it's Ham, he runs back out and gets his brothers together and says, look, we can't leave Dad this way. Let's at least cover up his shame. But nobody will look at him. And so they walk backwards carrying a blanket between them and drape it over him, as if anybody would do that. Well, and while he's then when Noah woke up and saw what his youngest son had done to him, he cursed that son's son who had nothing to do with it. So it's suffered in transmission, but originally it must have been Shem, Ham, Japheth, and Canaan as the fourth son, who castrated Noah. The ancient rabbis knew something had been omitted here because it was too shocking. I guess you didn't want to read about a guy getting castrated during the scripture reading in the synagogue, seriously. And so they figured, now what did he actually do? And some thought, well, maybe Canaan, or Ham, I don't know how they reconcile that one, but maybe he ran off and had sex with his own mother. Pretty distinct. That would make sense because in Leviticus they use for incest the phrase to uncover the nakedness of father or mother or whatever, and it's and this stuff with them covering the nakedness of their father, that could mean they saw his nakedness and went after Mrs. Noah, or Noria as the Gnostics called her. Well, others said, no, one of them sodomized Noah, and because they're trying to, and if it's Canaan, that would refer to the depraved religious practices of the Canaanites and their fertility religion, which involved various sexual things not typical of marriage. And but the third one was that they castrated him, and I would bet that that's it, because it fits the original Greek version, especially when you take a close look at the names, because Ham must stand for Baal Hamon, Canaanite god of heaven. Japheth is just a slightly different spelling of Iapetus, one of the sons of the Titan, who was worshipped by the Philistines, and so forth. And so it seems clear to me that that's what's going on here. It's just been mixed up in editing and in transition. So that's what I think happened, and that's where the story came from.
Yeah, so that's interesting. We discussed the castration thing, and we also discussed the mother kind of incest sort of story. And when we started talking about that, we started developing a link between that and then like what happened with Lot and his daughters after this other, earth-shaking catastrophe. Do you see any other links between this story and that?
Yeah, because they're both ethnological stories. That is, they're like a political cartoon trying to depict and to account for features of neighboring countries. For instance, the way the story of Noah cursing Canaan has been repurposed. It says that Shem, the ancestor of the Hebrews, is going to be blessed, and his descendants will intermarry with those of Japheth, the Philistines. And in the book of Judges, we have a couple of stories where Samson shacks up with Philistine women. So there's some sort of connection there. And that Canaan, however, is to be cursed, and his descendants will be the slaves of both of the others. Well, yeah, the Philistines and the Israelites defeated the Canaanites and between them, and enslaved them, as we see in Joshua, for instance. And it didn't have any reference to black Africans, though later rabbis who wanted to justify the enslavement of Africans interpret or misinterpreted Canaan in that story as being a black African, just like the slave owners in the South did, Presbyterian theologians and so on. Well, the thing with incest in the case of Lot and his daughters, this seems to have been part of the flood story originally. It looks like in the Greek version of that, Zeus has heard about the cannibalistic practices of the Lastrygonians, I think it is, and he says, I am sick of these people. I'm going to flood them out and start over. And Hermes says, wait just a minute, Dad. Let's not be hasty. There are a bunch of creeps down there, but they're good people too. And so to settle it, the two of them assume mortal guise and go on a reconnaissance mission. And they go to the one palace where the king invites them to a feast, and they uncover the main dish, and it's the body of the king's son. He's a cannibal. And I say, okay, that's one down. These people deserve to be destroyed. And then there's another one. I forget what the other negative one was, but they go to another town where they meet this old couple, Abaucus and Philemon, who are at the point of starving to death. But here are visitors, and they want to offer hospitality, so they invite the gods, whose identity they don't suspect, to come in. And we don't have much, but we'll share it with you. Here's a couple of bread crusts, and I think we got a couple of drops of wine in this pitcher. And so they're having a nice talk, and the wine does not run out. They keep getting full cups, and the old couple realizes something is wrong here. And they say to Zeus and Hermes, you guys wouldn't be gods, would you? They say, yeah, that's right. You guessed it. You didn't know it, though. You were just kind to us because we were visitors you didn't know from Adam. And as a result of that, we'll grant your wish. What would you like? And they say, well, we would like to, on our death, become pillars of a temple to Zeus. And so he says, all right. And so they are transformed into trees that become pillars of the porch of a Zeus shrine. Of course, that was a story people told the pilgrims who visited that. Why are you using these trees? Well, here's why. And so Zeus is convinced, yeah, all right, there are good people, but there are not enough of them. Turn on the faucet, and the flood comes, and the only ones who survive are a couple, Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survive in a big chest, which is what Ark means too, right? Like the Ark of the Covenant was a big box, and they don't bring any relatives or anything. It's just the two of them, but they survive the flood. They get out of the box, and they repopulate the world by throwing the stones of the ground over their shoulders, because there's a pun between the Greek word for stone and the Greek word for people, just like there is in Hebrew, where the God can raise up sons from these stones. Same thing. Anyway, they survive the flood, and that's that. Well, it's obvious that's been chopped up in transmission so that God is thinking of flooding the earth and tells Abraham, not Noah in this version, and he says, well, I'm going to flood them out. We're going to take a look here at Sodom and Gomorrah and see if these rumors are true. And Abraham says, that's not sporting. I mean, you're the judge of all the earth. You've got to be just and fair. Suppose there's 50 righteous people down there. You don't want to kill them too, do you? And so God is a pushover, and he says, yeah, all right, if there are 50, I'll let the whole bunch go. And then he starts thinking, I've heard those rumors about Sodom and Gomorrah myself. My nephew Lot moved there, and I hear stuff from him. And he says, well, how about this? And I always think of Maxwell Smart here. Well, would you believe 45? And they're 45. And he's, well, yeah, sure, why not? And then he negotiates down to, Suppose there are 5 righteous in the city. Yeah, all right. I'll spare it if you can even find 5. Well, it happens. The 2 angels go down there, and they're threatened by a mob at the door, and that's enough for the angels. And they say, "Look, you better get out of here. If you have any relatives here, take them and go quick." And so they do, but then they take refuge. The only ones that survive are Lot and his 2 virgin daughters, right? And then they take refuge in this cave in a cliff, and the daughters say, "Well, Dad's asleep. We're really stuck here. There are no men on earth for us to be impregnated by. Let's get him drunk and have him impregnate us," as if that would be possible if you're passed out drunk. And so they both get impregnated one after the other. And what are the results of this? Well, one of them is named Ben-Ami, the son of my people. The other is named Me'ab, which means in Hebrew, from a father, hint, hint. These 2 guys become the ancestors of the Ammonites and the Moabites. And of course, the whole thing is just an ethnic joke saying, "You ever wonder why our cousins who live not far away are a bunch of stupid degenerates? Well, here's why." Surely that's the point. And but doesn't this assume that the human race is largely gone? That the world flood has destroyed all candidates for impregnating these women, and they've taken refuge in a high cliff because of the water. And so what you have is bits and pieces of the flood story combined with the Sodom and Gomorrah thing, which in turn has a parallel in Judges 19. The same thing happens with the ravening mob outside the door and the offer of the women and all this. It's just fascinating. It's all reshuffled like this.
Yeah. So I think that's super interesting. So Cain creates the first city, Enoch. And then we have the Tower of Babel where God comes down and shuffles up at everybody. And then the Sodom and Gomorrah stories. Do you see that there could be like a message in Genesis or maybe even in the whole Bible about like an anti-civilization sort of thing?
Well, there is what they used to call priestcraft, where you have the priestly elite ruling over the sheep in their flock. Look, why don't you leave the thinking about the gods to us? We know it, just like the Vedic priests in ancient India. You don't have to know about the theology of the gods, sacrifices, the sacred mushroom that would bring them heavenly visions, hallucinations. They would get it straight, but in order to give a derivative religious experience to the flock, they would urinate after they and let the people drink their urine. So they heavenly visions, because if they had with the priests and you want to safeguard your prerogatives and so forth. Well, the banning of the tree of knowledge, God, Yahweh, is desperate that the humans don't get the knowledge that the Tower of Babel, it's God goes down to see how the humans are doing, and he sees them working on this tower, and he says, "Good God, I had no idea they were capable of to do." He's threatened. Gods again. He says, "Let's go confuse their language so they can't work together anymore." That ought to do it. And it happens, and they just give up making the tower, because one guy's saying, "Hand me some more mortar," and the other one hands him a hammer. He says, "What's the matter?" And they can't understand each other anymore.
Right.
Well, why threatening character of the people having the knowledge that only the gods have. Of course, what that means. And so I don't think they're against civilization per se. They're just, though I can see how you can read it that way, but it seems to me that they don't want humans to get uppity, and that means priests want the ordinary believers to know what was going on.
Oh yeah, so that leads perfect into this thing that I needed to ask you, because it's a mystery to me. I can't make heads or tails of it, other than this priestly class and this kingly class business that we read about when we get into like the Masons and stuff. But I was hoping to get your take on this Melkezedik character. Yeah, so like later in the Bible, Jesus is referred to as he's a priest in the order of Melkezedik, and Melkezedik shows up and he's like, "Hey, I'm a priest king." And it is sort of like, it seems mysterious, like it's a mystery to me, and I can't figure it out. And I actually found some guy online who claims that he's a priest of the order of Melkezedik, and I tried to talk to him about it, and it became a mess. So I was hoping that you might be able to shed some light or your thoughts on it.
Well, in chapter 15, somewhere in Genesis, Abraham was sort of pictured suddenly as a king, basically, with his own army. And again, think of the patchwork character of these stories. His nephew Lot is kidnapped, implying he's a very important person because somebody needed him as a hostage. He's kidnapped by one of the kings in an alliance opposed to Abraham and some other kings, including the king of Sodom. And there's no stain on them in this story, like there is 4 chapters later. And one of the kings that Abraham allies himself with is I love this. It's like this guy must have been the founder of cheese, because his name is Cheddar Lamer. But at any rate, I think he's well, at any rate, they do defeat these guys, and they're talking about. I guess this guy was a king of Sodom, and they're talking about dividing up the booty, and Abraham somehow doesn't like these guys. We're not really told that they're sinners here, but he says, no, I won't have it said that I took as much as a shoestring from the likes of you, interestingly. But then Melchizedek, the king of Salem, which apparently was the pre-Israelite Jebusite version of Jerusalem. And he comes out offering bread and wine to Abraham. And he blesses him in the name of El Elyon, the Most High God. And Abraham accepts it and says something similar about Yahweh El Elyon. And this implies that this story is in there to justify the Deuteronomic fusion of the former head God with the Israelite God. So, okay, El Elyon and Yahweh from now on are the same one. So that may be the point of that. You see Melchizedek a couple of more times in, I think it's Psalm 110, which is an enthronement psalm, where that would be sung to the new king every time one took the throne. Psalm 2 is another one of those. Well, in 110 it says, Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Well, that pretty much has to mean that when the Israelites took over Jerusalem, they decided to keep the priesthood of Melchizedek, who wasn't just one guy. Like we hear of another Jebusite priest king named Adonai Zedek. Melchizedek means Zedek, or righteousness. but the name of a god. Zedek is my king. Melchi or Malak or Melech, etc., means king. And this other guy, Adonizedek, means that Zedek is my Lord, which is what Adonai means. So they must have all had these theophoric names, these god, like the Egyptian pharaohs did. And so they had priest kings, and once the Israelites took over, their kings became ordained as the priests of Melkezedik and of Zedek, the god in charge. So we don't know much more about that, but in the Epistle to the Hebrews, there is a reflection of a growing deification of the Melchizedek character. And the writer to the Hebrews says that Jesus is like Melchizedek, who had neither father nor mother, nor beginning nor end of days, but like the Son of God remains a priest forever.
Wow.
What? So Jesus is a heavenly immortal. And we're pretty sure it means that because in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it speaks of the apocalyptic coming of Melchizedek as a kind of an angelic avenger. And it says, just as it was prophesied, behold, Israel, your Elohim comes to you, your God. So Melchizedek is understood that late in the day as a kind of a god.
Wow.
We find in Gnostic texts, he's a heavenly being. In some sermon, I think, by St. Augustine, hundreds of years later, he warns Christians not to esteem Melchizedek as higher than Jesus. And there were two Melchizedek sects as well. One Gnostic, one not. Like, what was going on? I mean, he is like a heavenly savior in his own right. And the Epistle of the Hebrews says, well, that's just like Jesus. And in fact, it's also just like Moses and Abel and various other ones and Enoch, who were made into like divine beings in the sectarian Judaism of the New Testament period.
Yeah. So, well, thank you again for that. I really enjoyed it, and all that Enoch stuff really gets me going. Like, I don't know. I'm a comic book artist. I do graphic novels and stuff, and I always include Enoch as like this like little old guy in like an angelic power armor, because he's been taken up to heaven and dressed like an angel. So I love that you included him so much in the talk this evening.
I once thought of writing a comic book called Enoch, the Son of Man, because there's several writings of books of Enoch and so on. And like they figured, why was he taken up to heaven, and why does he walk with God? And his lifespan is 365 years. Well, he was originally a personification of the sun. And so in these later Enoch apocalypses, he becomes an angelic being of fire, and then takes he's also called Metatron, and he the right hand of God, and is even called the Lesser Yahweh. So, I mean, holy mackerel, he was a superstar also.
Yeah, it's really good stuff. So, I feel like I'm taking advantage of your time, but I have like one more thing I want to run past you. It's kind of like my pet theory.
Sure.
Yeah. So, as we were going through Genesis, I started noticing this kind of theme. So when I say I'm going through Genesis and also Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews, which is kind of like the Brothers Grimm of like a Jewish oral tradition. And so I started mapping out this idea of these different blessings, curses, and I also factored in this kind of lineage of, in Legends of the Jews, Ginsberg talks about these luminous garments that God created for Adam and Eve, and like what happened to them as Genesis progresses. So I kind of like mapped all of this stuff out, and it seems
I remember looking at that. Yeah, sorry about that. I wish I'd studied it more and had a better recollection of it.
No, it's cool. Like I mean, I just hit you with it, without like much kind of like softening up or whatever. But I noticed like this idea of like the wrong son getting the blessing, and then also the wrong son getting these magic underpants and stuff. So, like between Abel gets killed, Cain gets excommunicated or whatever, so Seth gets the blessing, which is technically would be like the wrong son getting the blessing. And then that moves down to Ham's son Cain getting the curse for his dad, for what his dad did, and then ultimately ends with Jacob and Esau. And I was wondering, am I crazy? Have I read too much of this stuff? Or do you think that there might be something there that I should be looking at more?
I think it's worth pursuing. I know that it's often noticed that you have the blessing going to the younger, not the older, and that creates friction. Like that's why Esau wants to kill Jacob and so forth. And it's often understood as being another kind of political cartoon thing, that it reflects the changing power patterns of these groups of tribes that are said to be descended, like the Ishmaelites from Ishmael, the Edomites from Esau, and so on and so on. That one of these tribal leagues was in power and dominated the area, probably in trade and military prowess and so forth. But as time went by, the formerly subject group who all believed they were interrelated, that they became more prominent, and so the formerly lesser dominated the older, and once what did I just say, the ones who were on the bottom went to the top. And one big clue on this is where Esau goes to the blind Isaac and says to him, I've been ripped off here. He deceived you, and so he got the blessing. And he says, "Can't you do something about it?" And Isaac says, "I can't. I've given the blessing. I can't retract it," because these people figured that it would happen. It was like if you cursed somebody, something bad would happen. If you blessed them, good would come of it. It wasn't just a nice thing to say. And then Esau says, "Well, Father, do you have only one blessing to give? And is there something for me?" And then he says, "Well, all right. In the future, your descendants will take back over again." Well, scholars have thought what's happened here is that the story got updated at a subsequent period where the Edomites did dominate the Jews or Israelites or whatever you want to call them. And so they had to update the story. They couldn't leave it standing so that it looked like forever Israel will dominate Edom, because the roles were reversed. So God must have, or Isaac must have predicted that too. And that's kind of where I take it. And I think all of these guys, these Genesis patriarchs, really are just fictive ancestors, kind of like Uncle Sam figures. But I don't know. Well, you're pointing out that there's more to it. Like I don't think it says in Genesis anything about it says that God made them coats of skin, like leather, Tarzan and Jane outfits, apparently. And then later on, they say, the Kabbalistic interpreters say, no, before the fall, at least Adam was a mighty spiritual being, a cosmic giant made of light. And he was supposed to regather the spilled photons of the Shekinah, the glory cloud of God that had been lost in the universe. And he had it all together. He had gathered it, but then he tripped over something and it crashed to the ground and it was scattered again. And because of this failure, this was the real fall. And that God shrank him down to the dimensions of a mortal man and gave him a body of flesh, and that was the coats of skin. So even that doesn't quite match the luminous garments, though that does come up eventually in terms of the resurrection body, that they compare that even in the New Testament to kind of a light garment, as it says God is clothed in light. It's supposed to be the resurrection body for humans. But I don't know, that is well worth pursuing.
Yeah, so the luminous garments business is very interesting because it's like it was supposed to give Adam the control over the animals, and it was supposed to give him like super strength, like you were just saying. And then eventually, once Canaan gets cursed, Ham steals I flippantly call them the magic underpants on the show. So Ham steals them from Noah, who received them as a birthright, and through Canaan, it eventually winds up in Nimrod's possession. And then Nimrod uses them, like Nimrod's this great hunter. Well, the idea is that Nimrod uses them to control the animals that come to him so he can kill. So that makes him the great hunter. And then this also kind of fills in this spot about like Nimrod. He might have been one of these Nephilims or one of these giants, or he might have been doing something to make himself into one of these Nephilims from Genesis 6. And then Esau winds up in this is not in the scripture. This is in Ginsburg. Esau winds up killing Nimrod, and then he takes the magic underpants. And I thought all that, the way that they track it through, it was just fascinating, and I just wanted to pay a lot of attention to it.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. You wonder at what point these various retellings occurred and why. It's possible some of it was left over from the ocean of traditions that didn't happen to get into the canonical book of Genesis, because some of the Nag Hammadi Gnostic retellings of Eden, and there are a few of them, seem at some points to be preserving other versions of the Eden story, and that they may be just as old or older. And that could be the case with some of this.
Yeah. So I grew up and I was in a Southern Baptist environment. And so it was all hellfire and brimstone for me growing up. And so I was always like geared into Revelations, right? But then as I got older, and I was like, no, Genesis is where it's all at. It's like the Maury Povich kind of show of the Bible. So I spent a lot of time like paying attention and going through it over and over again. And I thank you just so much for your insight and all the time that you set aside to kind of talk us through all of this. I appreciate your scholarly approach and your insights. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. I love talking about the stuff, so I'm pleased to be on the show.
All right. Do you have anything that you would like to promote, or I know you got I believe you have a book or two coming out?
I've co-edited with John Loftus a book called Varieties of Jesus Mythicism, where we have a bunch of articles by people who uphold or advocate several different mythicist theories, very different from one another, that I suspect a lot of readers even interested in the subject have not heard. And I'm still waiting for a couple of them to come in, so it'll still be a while, but that's going to be a real goodie. Also, very shortly, the fourth volume of my series, Holy Fable, is due out from Pitchstone Press. The first one, which I think you would enjoy if you haven't seen it, holy fable, the Old Testament undistorted by faith. That gets into all this weird stuff about Genesis. And then the second one, holy fable, the Gospels and Acts undistorted by faith. The third one, holy fable, the epistles and the apocalypse undistorted by faith. And then this fourth one does critical but sympathetic analyses of the parts of the Book of Mormon, the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ, the Gospel of Thomas, the libretto of Jesus Christ Superstar, and Lovecraft's Necronomicon. And so that's going to be out pretty quickly. And just had a collection of my horror stories, horrors and heresies, that my wife and I published. It's on Amazon. That gets into a lot of the stuff with Apollonius of Tyana and the Sanhedrin of the 50, Jesus as the Golem, and all kinds of neat stuff.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds crazy.
And it seems to me there's something else coming out that I forget. But anyway, you can look me up on Amazon. There's a bunch of books.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Price. I really am just tickled with our conversation, and I am honored, and I'm just happy that you took your time out for the show. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. I'll be on again anytime you want.
All right.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Send an email or visit us on social media to let us know what you think about this topic. And please remember to leave a 5-star rate and review.